I want to talk about Wordsworth's poem Resolution and Independence. He composed it in 1802, published it in 1807. I want to focus on three elements of the poem that I think will help you get into it in a thoughtful fashion. The first is we see in this poem Wordsworth's imagination at work. How so? Well, we first of all have to note that Wordsworth in 1800 actually had an experience of a leech gatherer, and he did it along with his sister Dorothy. And Dorothy actually leaves behind in her notebooks an account, her journals, we might say, an account of this experience. And to contrast her description of the leech gatherer with Wordsworth's description of the leech gatherer in the poem is quite instructive. I'll just read little snippets of her description of the leech gatherer, and then we can look at Wordsworth's very briefly as well. So, Dorothy and William see this man out in nature. They're out on a walk. And Dorothy says he had dark eyes and a long nose. His trade was to gather leeches, but now leeches are scarce, and he had no strength for it. He lived by begging and was making his way to Carlisle, where he should buy a few goodly books to sell. He said leeches were very scarce, partly owing to this dry season, but many years they have been scarce. He supposed it owing to their being much sought after, that they did not breed fast and were of slow growth. Leeches were formerly this amount, a larger amount, and now they're this amount, a smaller amount. He had been hurt in driving a cart. His leg broke, his body driven over, his skull fractured. He felt no pain till he recovered from his first insensibility. Now, this is a very brisk, specific, almost journalistic account. She sketches the harsh realities of this leech gatherer rapidly and clearly. Well, 2 years later, Wordsworth has a morning like he describes in the poem Resolution and Independence, where he's feeling very exuberant, and then suddenly he feels dejected, he feels despair, thinks of poets who have ended very poorly, like Chatterton and Burns, but then suddenly he sees this old man close by a pond. And he says, as a huge stone is sometimes seen to lie, couched on the bald top of an eminence, wonder to all who do the same espy, by what means it could thither come, and whence, so that it seems a thing endued with sense, like a sea beast crawled forth, which on a shelf of rock or sand reposeth there to sun itself. So this is instructive. Wordsworth is not interested in the same details of this man that Dorothy is, not by a long shot. He immediately turns this man, this historical man, with very marked physical characteristics and a very compelling story, he immediately turns this man into a symbol. He likens the man to a rock or a sea beast. And then in conversing with the man, he's less interested in what the man has to say and more interested in what thoughts he has as the man is talking, even to the point where he asks the man what he does, and as the man's telling him, he thinks about something else. And then, as if kind of shaken out of his reverie, the poet asks the man again, what do you do? As if he were not listening at all. We can see another dichotomy between Dorothy and William if we look at her description of daffodils one day, and then look at William's version of that same experience in I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. So we see here Wordsworth very actively coloring the ordinary with his imagination, which is what he says he wanted to do in lyrical ballads, and he certainly is doing it here, where the object is less important as an intrinsically interesting object and more important as a reflection of the poet's thoughts. That's one thing, too. Here, Wordsworth, as he did in Lines Written in Early Spring and as he does in the Intimations Ode, marks how seemingly randomly our emotions can shift. He says, I'm enjoying this morning. It rained last night. There's a unity running throughout the natural world. There's this lovely image of a rabbit running across the damp meadow, and from in the splash, Wordsworth can see the sunbeams. Beautiful. But all of a sudden, with no warning, he starts feeling despondency. Where does it come from? How does it happen? Wordsworth is excellent at capturing the seemingly random fluctuations of emotions. He gets that what we would call depression is seemingly causeless. You can feel perfectly good and have no reason at all to be sad, and suddenly, out of nowhere, boom, it hits you, and you feel darkness and alienation and despondency. And that's exactly what happens here, which makes what we would call depression, Wordsworth wouldn't use that language, more pernicious than if it had a cause. If the depression has a cause, you can just kind of think, okay, that's where it came from. I can avoid certain behaviors, and therefore the depression won't come again. But if the depression is causeless, as clinical depression, again using our terminology, is much of the time, then it's even scarier because you don't know how to avoid it. You can't avoid it. When it comes, it comes. So I think that's one reason that the poet falls into such deep despair. I felt amazing, and then I went to the opposite extreme and I felt terrible. And I don't really know why. And he feels terrible to the point, again, where he thinks about Chatterton, who committed suicide, and Robert Burns, who basically drank himself to death. So these are very dark thoughts. So that's the second thing. Wordsworth's attention to the random fluxes of emotions and these quick switches from dark to light, light to dark. So the third thing I want to note is that, and this goes back to the beginning a little bit, is how Wordsworth does treat this leech gatherer. So what does he see in the leech gatherer? What does the leech gatherer do? He wanders around the heaths, and he finds pools and ponds, and he puts his bare legs in these pools and ponds and lets the leeches latch onto his legs, and he pulls his legs out, and now he has the leeches that he can then give to physicians. Of course, leeches at that time were often applied to people who were ill, the idea being that there was some kind of imbalance in a person who is sick in terms of the fluids of one's body. So drain some blood, maybe you'll feel better. Obviously, this is very bad medicine. So Wordsworth sees in this leech gatherer a kind of self-sacrifice, a life of sacrifice, a life of attending to otherness that pulls him out of his despair. He realizes ultimately that his despair is narcissistic, that he doesn't have real reason to feel so awful, especially when he compares his life to that of the really difficult life of the leech gatherer. But part of this dynamic is that we see that Wordsworth really doesn't pay attention to the leech gatherer as an other. The leech gatherer is simply an occasion for him to talk himself out of feeling depressed. So on the one hand, we can say, okay, he notices the leech gatherer and values the leech gatherer for the leech gatherer's fortitude in the face of a very hard life. Okay, so he appreciates the leech gatherer. He's paying attention. But then at the same time, he's not paying attention at all. Again, he asked the leech gatherer twice, well, what do you do? Which suggests he's not listening at all. So here we see what I would say is a contradiction in Wordsworth's theory of imagination. On the one hand, you can say that to write about the natural world, the rural world as he does, requires for him to pay close attention to ordinary things, ordinary people, ordinary objects. And he does that. And we can say this is worthy. We acknowledge the valor of this because he's taking poetry to a place where it had not been taken much before, and that is to the everyday, away from the heroic, the grand, the aristocratic. But at the same time, in very actively imbuing the ordinary, again with the colors of his imagination, he risks ultimately pushing that object or person away and just seeing himself, really. Seeing that person almost as a mirror in which he watches his own mind work, watches his own mind move. So there's really a contradiction. On the one hand, Wordsworth is very much open to otherness. He wants to take his sameness and open it up to difference. But also, with the active imagination, there's a danger of taking the difference and making it the same. So there's this odd tension between charity and a kind of narcissism. So these are the three things I think we see at work in the poem, and hopefully these 3 points will help you go into the poem yourself.